Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform, for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
Tonight's talk is titled Circling the Flaming Lamp, but I'm going to start with another story about, has a little bit to do with the urgency of this topic tonight. And this may sound familiar with the exception of one phrase in here, so let's see if you recognize this from the Buddha's teachings. Just as it would be foolish for a person shot with a poisoned arrow to refuse treatment until he or she knows such details as whether the archer is short or tall, is fair-skinned or of dark complexion, is a village or a city dweller, so too it would be foolish for the Buddhist environmentalist to become so preoccupied with arguing in support of nature's intrinsic value that the time for decisive action is lost. Therefore, in the same way that one desires to protect oneself from affliction, grief, and the like, so an attitude of protectiveness and of compassion should be practiced towards the world. And then continuing with this idea of circling the flaming lamp, there's another discourse from the Pali Canon where the Buddha described 2,500 years ago the entire world as ablaze with the three fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's called the Fire Sermon. And in recent decades, we've recognized the blazing fire of greed, which really might be called the religion of consumerism. And we've discovered how greed particularly has played a key role in driving environmental degradation. And the Buddha uses burning flames to highlight another teaching about greed in this story. One time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove at the garden of Anathapindika. And at that time, he was seated under the open sky on a night of blinding darkness while oil lamps were burning. And also at that time, a great number of winged insects were flying around and falling into those oil lamps, thus meeting with misfortune, meeting with ruin, meeting with both misfortune and ruin. The Buddha saw those great number of winged insects flying around and falling into the oil lamps. And then the Buddha, understanding the meaning of this, gave utterance at that moment to this profound utterance. Rushing up, but then too far, they missed the point, only causing ever newer bonds to grow. So obsessed are some by what is seen and heard, they fly just like these moths, straight into the flames. So he's talking about these insects who are drawn irresistibly in the dark night to shining lamps. And by the way, I recently read somewhere that if you have outdoor lights, to turn them off at night because you will permit some insects not to meet their doom by getting too close to light, crashing into it. So drawn to the shining lamps, but in their zeal to approach the light, go too far and meet their doom. And humans likewise are drawn to the pleasures of the senses, to what is seen and heard, not realizing at times the dangers involved. And when we get too close, when we hold on with too much attachment, we too are burned. The danger to the moths that were circling the Buddha's lamp, the danger was not external, but came from their instinctual attraction to the flames, which again is not unlike our tendencies toward greed for, a comfortable lifestyle or material commodities. The big question that each moth must have faced was whether it would turn back before it was scorched by the flames. And the big question we must face is whether we'll change direction before we fly into our own flames of climate and environment degradation. So with the advent of spring comes Earth Day, which is 51 years old this month, believe it or not. A year ago, in April of 2020, National Geographic magazine offered the reader two views of life on Earth in 2070, 50 years from now. And here's that issue. On the one side, if you picked it up and began reading from this angle, I hope you can see this, it says, How We Lost the Planet, a Pessimist's Guide to Life on Earth in 2070. And the first half of the issue is dedicated to that perspective. If, on the other hand, you flipped the magazine to the other side, you might note the color change, and the title is How We Saved the World, an Optimist's Guide to Life on Earth in 2070. And isn't this a graphic example of how it is with us when we reflect on the nature of what is in the realm of, be it climate change or climate justice? We sense these shifts between rage and despair, hope and optimism, deadening and numbness. When it comes to the challenge of climate change, many of us, Buddhist or not, tend to focus on personal lifestyle changes that make a difference, like electric cars, solar panels on roofs, or eating less meat. And these are important, and they're not sufficient. It's been said that even if 10 or 15% of us do everything we can to reduce our own carbon footprint, the trajectory of the hara remains the same. On the other hand, if even 10% of us also work to change the system, that may be sufficient. Because the problem isn't only personal, but structural, the way our present economic and political institutions continue to favor fossil fuels, for example, and encourage consumerism generally. And at times, these issues are intimidating. We begin to think, what can we do about the fossil fuel industry or investment firms? So we become tempted to deny or ignore these aspects of our situation, despite the fact that the Buddhist teachings tell us to face the suffering, acknowledge it, rather than trying to evade it. And the question then may be, is there something in those teachings that actually may pull us in the direction of not bothering with ecological engagement? So Buddhism is the path of awakening, but what exactly does that mean in this realm? Joanna Macy, who's a Buddhist activist and teacher, writes that sometimes spiritual traps can hinder us from engaging with the world. The first one she points to is the trap that it comes from the viewpoint that devalues the world in comparison with some, quote, higher, unquote, spiritual reality. So this is the view that the phenomenal world is an illusion. It's impermanent, made of matter, and it's just a little less worthy than a realm of pure spirit. And its pains and its demands on us are less real than the pleasures or tranquility that we can find in transcending this. To see the phenomenal world only as an illusion is to dwell in an emptiness that's disengaged from the forms of the world. And according to this view, freedom from suffering is attained by non-attachment. And it's a non-attachment to the fate of all beings rather than the non-attachment to matters of the ego. For many modern Buddhists who perhaps aren't attracted by the traditional goals of ending rebirth, sometimes the path is understood more as a program of psychological development to help us let go of afflictive emotions and cultivate well-being. And the intention here is to reduce suffering by addressing greed, ill will, delusion, the three poisons. The spiritual trap here is that we may believe that all problems are somehow due to the way our mind works, and that the solution is simply to change the mind rather than change any system. And again, yes, personal transformation is critical to social revitalization, but exclusive attention to the inner domain of the mind can't remedy a crisis whose roots are conditioned in the systemic and ideological. So, traditional Buddhism perhaps is concerned with transcending in one way or another and this world that's unsatisfactory, the suffering that occurs here. Maybe a modern, more psychologically oriented Buddhism is about adapting to it better. And in the first case, the world is the problem because it's the place of suffering, while in the other, the mind is the problem. Both of these perspectives can have the effect, however, of devaluing social and ecological engagement. So when our attention is drawn to what is happening, in fact, our ecosystems are deteriorating quickly, and our collective response to the situation remains inadequate, to say the least. Both intentions, that of transcending or adapting, are somewhat resigned to the way the world is, and they're less concerned about reforming it. So another way to understand the Buddhist path might be to reflect on deconstructing and reconstructing the self, or the relationship between one's sense of self and the world. And this reconstruction involves looking at our motivations, which is really key to understanding the Buddha's innovative teaching on karma. He emphasized that intentions, because problems naturally result when we are motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion. So we must first transform motivation to see that the root of our problem is a sense of self that needs changing. Because the self is a construct, it's a cluster of impermanent processes, and it tends to be often insecure and a little bit anxious insofar as it feels separate from the rest of the world. And sometimes we experience this insecurity as a sense of lack, something's missing, with a notion that nothing external can satisfy. Maybe it's here that our meditation practice can resolve this feeling that something's wrong, or something's wrong with me, by, through reflection, revealing our interconnectedness with the world. So it's not about transcending this world necessarily, but rather coming to experience it in a different way. And in that experiencing of it, we face up to the prevalence of suffering within and without, which is really vital if we're going to respond to the crisis creatively, compassionately. Bhikkhu Bodhi has said that the most insidious manifestation of hatred is not ethnic or religious strife, but indifference. Indifference. It's the constricting of our concern to the private sphere of self, family, friends, which can leave us barely fazed by floods in Bangladesh or famine in Somalia, or the Great Pacific Garbage Dump, where 80,000 tons of plastic spread over an area 3 times the size of France, floating as a painful reminder of the extent of human greed and the degree of our mindless habits of consumption. Participation in the world, in our community, means that we open our eyes and our hearts to what's here and hold ourselves accountable. There's new language cropping up to talk about what is evolving, and one of the words that got coined 15 years ago, solastalgia. I didn't look up how to pronounce that. I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. Solastalgia is the homesickness you have when you are still at home, when your home environment is changing in ways that create distress. And examples would be Appalachian communities that are affected by mountaintop removal with coal mining, rural communities in New South Wales where there's persistent drought, large areas of Africa where agrarian communities have lost vital resources due to environmental change, and they have had to become refugees. So solastalgia, distress caused by a lack of interaction between the society in social and political ways that in turn affect the experience of a community, the members of a community. And as you might guess, it tends to happen in places where there is less income, less equity. So participation in the world and community means we open our eyes and our hearts to what's here. And we can contemplate whether today's injustices are really going to be changed, because we can begin to recognize false promises. For example, green technology sometimes promises fixes, but not really with the idea of discouraging consumption. It's holding out a promise of a future predicated on the impoverishment of the present, because no real social change happens. Engaged Buddhists encourage us not to become overwhelmed by the ubiquity of suffering in the natural world, but instead to focus on its beauty and diversity. And this is sort of that balancing act. We go between optimism, pessimism. And there's an archetype in Buddhism which can bring individual and social transformation together, and that's the archetype of the Bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas have a double practice. As they deconstruct and reconstruct themselves, they also work for social and ecological change. And actually, these are just two sides of the same practice. But even as we start to see through the delusion of our separateness, our deep-rooted and self-preoccupied habits don't suddenly disappear. We know this. So we need to develop less self-centered and a more compassionate way of living in the world. And the question, of course, is how do we do that? And Joanna Macy would say that we devote ourselves to the well-being of others, including the health of the world's ecosystems. She calls it cultivating a wild love for the world. So this wild love is not a distraction from our personal practice, but rather a deeper manifestation of it. In the case of climate change, awakened bodhisattvas embody the literal meaning of compassion as suffering with, remembering that to exploit the environment is not only to harm animals and plants, but also to injure oneself. So to be open and vulnerable is a political act of solidarity, because exposing ourselves to injustice can allow us to relinquish positions of privilege. From the usual standpoint, when we think about increasing desires, satisfying desires, there's a sense that development can proceed. But from the Buddhist standpoint, when there are fewer desires, there can be greater development. The Buddha also teaches that to protect the non-human is to protect humans as well, and to protect humans is to protect non-human elements. And when we do that, we counter a tendency to see either humans or non-humans only in terms of utility or as a problem to solve. There's a wonderful story told where Asian monks in Thailand and Vietnam and Sri Lanka responded to deforestation and illegal logging by tying monks' robes around tree trunks, a kind of tree ordination ceremony. And this was in an effort to shift the community's relationship with the forest. The trees in monks' robes can be revered and respected as teachers of the Dharma, of what's true. This we know, all things are connected like the blood that unites us. We did not weave the web of life, we are merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves, because we are the web, and the web is us. So one person in our group tonight said that the thought that this is a systemic issue can be so overwhelming that it's hard to know how to be, where to start, what to do. And just want to reiterate that the experience of disappointment, of anger, of sadness, of rage, of despair is all real. And what's required when we think about being bodhisattvas is that we work as hard as we can, for example, at decarbonizing the economy, but we give some time and space to feel the full embodied response of what's happening, to allow feelings of stress or a sense of shame that we haven't been able to do enough, or a sense of failure, or whatever it is, we allow that to just flow. So to some degree, we embrace the don't know mind, and we keep moving forward, because we don't know what all the consequences of our efforts will be. And just to reflect a moment again on Joanna Macy, she's 90 years old, and someone in an interview with her said, well, what about all the stuff you've done around environmental activism? She said, we need to keep moving forward. And what wonderful words to hear from someone 90 who has been practicing this for decades, environmental activism. Václav Havel, who is a writer and was Czech president, he wrote, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. So there will be grief. It's the form love takes when we lose something dear. And if we understand our feelings of love as something not abstract, not intellectual, not detached, we'll be inspired to prevent future losses. So true hope isn't an opiate that's purpose is to make us feel better. And despair isn't something to be explained away by science or dulled by communing with nature. Hope really takes root in suffering and sadness. So our practice is to be fully present to what arises, fear, gratitude, to all that is. The practice of mutual belonging, living members of this living body of earth. We're grounded in that kind of belonging. And to maybe, as some of you do already, to book in your days, your nights with practices that are beneficial, that serve you, whether those be practices of gratitude or kindness or compassion, or walking outside, even in the dark tonight. Because the final instruction to round out, to circle round to the image of lamplight, the final instruction is to be a lamp unto yourself. And here's a short story I'll close with. Last week, David and I went camping in a state park at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay at the northern end of Virginia Beach, where the bay waters contain frolicking dolphins, meets the ocean. The Chesapeake meets the Atlantic there. And from the campground, you can go out onto the beach on one of 4 curving boardwalks that end at the dune line. And each evening while we were there, just before sunset, there'd be a stream of people. Some were campers, some had come out from the city. And everyone would stroll along the boardwalks out to the beach to sit on the sand or on a chair or simply to stand. And all of us watching the sun slip down the orange, pink, purple sky to the horizon. The colors reflected in the bay waters, cormorants standing on old pilings. And for some moments, all of us absorbing, resting in the beauty with this day-ending ritual. Those special moments when we feel a deep connection, a wild love for the world, they can provide strength and perspective and give our lives a sense of meaning and purpose beyond material success. Because spirituality has to do with our inner sense of connection and our interrelationship with something larger than ourselves, a sort of sacred interrelationship of interbeing. So thank you all for being here tonight, for listening, and for your practice. It makes a difference.